Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. We're real pleased to have Delegate Ken Plum with us from Northern Virginia today. Welcome, sir.
Woody, it's always a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Group for sponsoring these programs. It's a great way to report back to our constituents what we're doing here.
Great. You're one of the longest serving members in the House of Delegates now. Did you ever believe that you would see the day where 15 new Democrats were elected to the House of Delegates?
Woody, I've been here 38 of the last 40 years, and I can tell you it's such a welcome change. Typical years it would be that you'd be talking about, say, 10% of the composition of the legislature being women, and now in the House of Delegates on the Democratic caucus side, 50% of our members are women.
50%.
And that is a welcome change because what it looks like, when you look at our caucus now, you're looking at Virginia. You're looking not only at men and women, but you're looking at Latinos, African Americans, you're looking at people from the LGBT community, you're looking at transgender people. We have now a composite of who it is that lives in Virginia. And I think when we get that kind of representation, we'll end up with better legislation that we pass.
And I take it a week ago, things were still up in the air. Hampton Roads was still undecided, and I guess the day before you convened, the situation in Stafford and Fredericksburg got resolved because a court would not intervene.
Yeah. You know, it was a historic election. If you had asked me a day before the election, I would have said to you, from the Democratic perspective, if we pick up 5 or 6 seats, that's probably about average, that's probably what we'll do. But if we could get 10 seats, I'd be ecstatic. We picked up 15 seats. The people in Virginia clearly had a message for us. They want some things to change. Things like this putting off the expansion of Medicaid, things like not dealing with issues of gun violence and so on. People are fed up with that. And with the attention to what happened on the national level, where we can realize what dramatic and dangerous things can happen when the control of the government gets out of hand, people came out and spoke in big numbers. And so elections that ahead of time didn't look like there was incumbent was any trouble at all. Incumbents who were chairs of committees, for example, prominent people, find themselves out of office. The message I think it sends to legislators is better stay in touch with your people to find out what it is they're concerned about and what the issues are of concern to them. So again, that's why programs like yours, in terms of allowing us to talk directly to people and explore the issues and so on, are so very critically important to establish that communications. The excitement that came this November that brought so many people to the polls, the concerns and so on, I hope it didn't go away. I mean, I don't want it to cool off. I want it to continue because we're not going to get it all done this legislative session. In fact, in a few days that we've been here, there are indications that we're not going to make as much progress as maybe we had hoped to, but we have the basis for building on it for progress.
There's a lot more transparency now, however, is there not?
Oh yeah, transparency is part of it, and that's what people kind of wanted to know, is what was going on. In prior years, bills would essentially kind of disappear. They'd go to a committee, to a subcommittee, never to be seen again. For example, I put in this bill to expand background checks for gun purchases. A lot of people acknowledge that that would be a way you could keep guns out of the hands of people who are dangerous, people who've committed crimes and so on. That bill would go to the Militia and Police Committee. It would always get sent to the Gun Subcommittee. It was 5 members on that committee, and 4 of them had straight A ratings with the NRA. Well, guess what happened to the bills? The bills lasted minutes. The discussion was very limited, and the bill would die. And so 4 people of 140 members of the General Assembly decided the outcome of what we should do about background checks.
And there was no recorded vote.
No recorded votes at the time. In that particular committee, they killed so many bills, we kind of all knew who killed the bills and so on. But throughout the legislature, with those subcommittees, you did not have a recorded vote that was easily acceptable to the public. And one of the things that's come about now is we have a legislature that's more equally balanced. It turns out to be 51 Republicans, 49 Democrats. With that more equal balance now, part of the outcome has been more transparency and more accessibility information about what we're doing. And that's really a very important step forward.
Now, have your committee assignments remained the same?
My committee's assignments are exactly the same. I've been on the Agricultural Conservation Natural Resources Committee as long as I've been here. To a lesser time, I've been on the Transportation Committee, on the Science and Technology Committee, and on the Rules Committee.
Now, let's talk about some of those big ticket items that you highlighted initially, because the governor in his remarks, I think there were 3 items he talked about in some detail: Medicaid expansion, gun control, which you've talked about a little bit, and reproductive/women's rights.
Yeah.
Talk to us in order and in some detail about those.
Well, I think it's hard to explain to people how it is. You have a situation like you have in the Commonwealth of Virginia where we have 400,000 people without health insurance.
400,000.
Right, okay. At the same time, the federal government, through the expanded Medicaid program, has $10 billion that would have been available to Virginia over the last 4 years. But we haven't availed ourselves of it because of a philosophical disagreement about what the role of the government ought to be in health care. And I can tell you, let's continue that philosophical discussion as long as we want to, but when there's money available from Virginians to serve Virginians, I think it's incumbent upon us that we avail ourselves of that money and make it available to people for their health.
Let me make sure I understand. Is there any way to recoup those monies?
No, there's
those
no way
are
to
gone.
recoup them. Those are gone. And in fact, 100% money that we could have gotten if we'd started in the beginning is now 90%.
Okay.
So we don't get quite as good a deal. But we do still yet get a good deal in the fact that we get able to cover so many different people so that when people are healthy, they're able to work and they're not a drain on society from volunteer organizations and so on. They're able to support themselves and be productive citizens. And I think that's what people want to do. I don't think people want to be a drain on the society. What happens then when you also fund health insurance, you also create jobs in the healthcare sector. And so that money that comes in also creates jobs for our economy. Furthermore, there are some things that we provide for out of the general fund now of where if you're totally indigent and can't get health care otherwise, you can go to the University of Virginia Hospital or the Virginia Commonwealth University Hospital and get health care at state expense. If we expanded Medicaid, we wouldn't be spending that couple $100 million. That would be available to us for other purposes. So there's so many good reasons why this makes sense. When you talk about it philosophically, about who should get the credit for a program, whether the government ought to provide, or the government ought to be involved in the healthcare industry and so on, you get a different outcome. But I would say to you that of the nations of the world, we have some of the poorest healthcare systems in the United States, and in the United States, Virginia has some of the poorest healthcare. There are people in Southwest Virginia whose medical care comes at the RAM, the Random Area Medical Program, which you heard the governor refer to in his address, because he goes out there as a volunteer doctor to help people. That's 1 day a year.
1 day a year.
1 day a year. Now, I volunteered out there myself previous summer, and I went on a Thursday to help to set up this 1-day health fair, and I left at 6:30 in the evening with the understanding the program was going to open the next morning at 7:30. Mm-hmm. I drove by 1.5 miles of people sleeping in their cars.
Sleeping in their cars.
To be available the next morning to try to be early in line, right? So that shows how desperate the need is. But there's not only RAM programs like that, like in WISE that's been going now for some years, but there's a RAM program in Accomack County. There's a WISE program, there's one in Wise County, the one I'm talking about, and then another in Southwest Virginia and another in Southside Virginia. Those programs were designed for third world countries, and they're now serving Virginians. We just absolutely must find a common ground. I don't care what we call our program. I don't care who gets the credit for it. I simply want the resources that are available to go to the people who need them. That, I think, is the moral thing to do. And I have been so proud of Governor Northam, a physician who knows directly what the needs are, to speak so forcefully about how it is that he wants us to take action this session.
Now let's talk a little bit more in detail about Medicaid and who it covers and who it does not. Who it would cover, I think there are individuals, working individuals who would be covered now.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. This is, the Medicaid program generally, essentially covers older people, old people, if you will, and people who are handicapped, and children who have handicap or don't have access to health care programs. The program that we're talking about now stands between that Medicaid program and people who can buy insurance. If you can buy insurance, you buy insurance. If you fall in the gap here, that's what helps people who work but don't make enough money to buy insurance. Insurance is expensive. And that Medicaid expansion would fill in that group of people.
So there are about 400,000 individuals of that ilk.
Yeah,
then.
exactly.
So what do you think is going to happen this session?
It's unclear to me at this point. I'm encouraged by the fact that the governor seems to be willing to so forcefully negotiate an arrangement for this. If you look across the 32 states that have done this already, they have a variety of ways in which they've structured a program. And I think what Governor Northam is going to be able to do is to work with the opposition to find a structure, if that's part of it, that would be accommodating to them, that they'd be willing to go forward with and to use. So I'm hopeful, and I hope the people of Virginia will continue to make sure that we as legislators know that they think this is the right thing to do.
Now, what impact would this have on the opioid crisis that the Commonwealth and the nation is currently suffering under?
And it's unclear what the connection between the two would be, but you're absolutely right that if you look at where we have medical crises, there are two others that we need to talk about, and the opioid one is the first. And that is not only with education and then control of the distribution of opioids, and then naloxone, is that how you say it? The additive that can be used to save people's lives. All those things in combination kind of have to occur for us to get on top of this thing. It's astonishing to me to hear the stories about how people so quickly can get hooked, addicted on the opioids. So we've got on the front end that people know the concerns about that, and then make sure that in our prescribing policies, we're very cautious about our prescribing policies. And then on the other hand, the kind of treatment things, the interventions that are necessary. That is a crisis. The number of people that are dying is phenomenal now in Virginia. And it's not evenly distributed across the state, but sometimes it's in our most disadvantaged neighborhoods. It's kind of crazy how it works. You'd think it would be where people had money to have access, but not necessarily true. Sometimes it's people don't have money.
Well, apparently it's also morphed into a heroin crisis as well, because to the extent the state has been able to stop certain physicians from over prescribing these painkillers, people have turned to heroin.
Well, addiction seems to be that way. You get addicted, you're going to stay addicted somehow to get that feedback, and the treatment intervention is so critically important, and the intervention also to save people's lives who get hooked on this stuff and seemingly can't help themselves, to get them to save their lives so we can go forward and save them. Because it's tragic to see what happens to families. A lady in my community, her brother passed away at a very early age from an overdose, and she now has a program of education and also making available naloxone in the community for those people who need access to it. But it's a major concern. And I said it's one of two public health problems. The other public health problem I would mention would be the use of guns. The tragedy occurred in my neighborhood just about a month ago, And it's a long story, but what happened essentially was that the mom and dad found out that the daughter was involved with a young man who had all these signs of being a Nazi.
Yes, I remember reading about that.
Yeah, all the, he had on his website and so on, all the symbols and all this kind of stuff. So they forbade the daughter to see him any lot more. The daughter herself, the daughter was mentally ill. What ensued was a confrontation between the man and woman and the young man. He shot him dead, shot both of them dead. This is a woman whose specialty was elder care. She was a lawyer who took care of older people and their financial affairs and all that sort of stuff, and she was much beloved in the community because she had this talent and so helped the people. And her husband, again, was a federal employee and recognized as a real scientific expert. The 17-year-old then tried to shoot himself, but he wasn't successful, so he's still in intensive care in the hospital, but he'll be charged with 2 murders. That was a tragedy that occurred right around the holidays. The brother of the young woman was in the home. The grandparents were visiting, and it happened at 5 o'clock in the morning. It sent tremors through our community. And you wonder then, how does a 17-year-old walk around with access to not only a pistol he shoots them with, but other weapons as well? And it's a story that it happens too many times. And we see young children shooting themselves or shooting other people. These mass murders, gosh knows, for a little bit, we had a record at Virginia Tech. Well, that record has long ago been surpassed.
Right.
And it used to be when I grew up, I think you'd hear about a mass murder maybe every decade. Now you hear them several a year. I know all about the Second Amendment and all that. And yes, people can have access to guns, but we're talking about people who are deranged, people who are mentally ill, people who are violent by nature shouldn't have access to guns. And so we can pass reasonable laws, as other states are doing. It's always a big debate here, very controversial, but I don't believe a person's right to own a gun exceeds another person's right to live with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We got this thing out of kilter. You can own your gun, but if your purpose of owning a gun is taking somebody's life, then you don't have a right to own that gun.
And of course, intertwined with that public health issue, Medicaid, is mental health. We had the tragedy with Senator Creedy. We had the tragedy recently in Montgomery County. As a matter of fact, there's a new member of the House of Delegates whose wife was killed as a result.
He was a fiance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Killed on the TV. While the people were watching
Right.
TV, they saw
Right.
her assassinated. I'm pleased at the progress we're making in mental health. We have finally, I think, come to recognize that if you go to a jail, for example, and inventory the people who are there, about a third of them are mentally ill. They have behaviors that got them in trouble, behaviors in public that cause them to get arrested. But if you try to understand what those behaviors are about, sometimes they're just sick. They're just mentally ill. And locking them up doesn't make them get well. It generally makes them get worse. And as a consequence, if you just turn them back out on the street, you got a repeat of a problem. So can you intervene with those folks and make a difference with therapy and drugs and so on? The answer is yes, you can make a difference with them. And we're doing a better job of that, I'm pleased to say. The other thing that I'm like this we've had happen here in the last couple of years is responding to the concern about the classroom to jailhouse pipeline. Too many kids, we all grew up, we all were involved in playthings and so on, and behaviors that as adults we wouldn't engage in. We were kids, but we didn't hurt anybody, we didn't destroy anything, but our behaviors were unacceptable. Increasingly lately it's been a problem of where police who were put into the schools as a concern about protecting the school from outside influences have suddenly now become an officer of the school arresting kids for childlike behavior. That's crazy. We got things out of kilter here again, I think. So rather than to take a child who has an acting out incident at school and deciding that's a crime, charging them, arrest them, and put them in jail? I don't know, we don't need to do that. We need to have them get appropriate counseling and intervention. and use the police for what they're there for, and that's to protect the school from outside sources of troubles and so on. We've come to recognize now that this has gotten out of hand and that we need to put more emphasis on, again, appropriate, age-appropriate intervention with children to not make them criminals. Some people would want to have you believe that kids start out being criminals. They don't start out being criminals. They learn to be criminals. And one of the ways you can teach them to be a criminal real quick is to put them in a jailhouse with a bunch of criminals. Then you've got yourself a real problem. But if in the early times when their behavior is not appropriate, you can have an intervention with counseling and so on to show them and demonstrate to them appropriate behavior and how they're supposed to act, you can turn those young folks around. And there's so many stories now of volunteers, athletes and others, who go into neighborhoods and volunteer as role models, for example, to get kids right off the right track. We need to get kids on the right track, not in the jailhouse.
You mentioned the number of new women who now populate the House of Delegates.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the governor talked about in terms of one of his priorities was, reproductive and women's rights. Talk to us about those.
Yeah, well, there's some things the government should get involved in and some things the government should stay out of. And one of them is a very sacred individual right that a woman has in terms of her own body and her reproductive rights and her health generally. I don't want to, as a legislator, to make decisions for women in circumstances that I can't describe or understand, circumstances that might involve a boyfriend, it might involve a stepfather, it might involve a brother, all kinds of situations that women find themselves into where they then have to make a critical decision. I don't know what that critical decision outcome should be. My recommendation would be that the woman turn to whatever spiritual influence she has, whatever her faith might be, and the doctor to work out that recommendation for her own life. But to blatantly say that you can or you cannot do this or that as it relates to abortion or access to abortion is assuming that legislators have a role much more mighty than they do have. Governor Northam's a medical doctor. He knows that. He knows that the issues are too complex. You only need to sit and talk with one or two people who've been involved in that circumstance to understand how complicated those decisions are. It's not yes or no, right or wrong, up or down. It has many facets to it. And again, we have to be respectful of women. If men were in the position of having babies, the laws would look different.
Yes,
yep.
Yes.
And men have been making laws for women for too long, and now women are going to be at the table. And we're going to have to deal with the realities that women have had to all their lives deal with. And that gets worked then into the laws, and we end up with better government, I think, as a result of that. And certainly a government that's more responsive to women's needs than we may have been in the past.
2020 will be here before we know it, and of course that's the next redistricting year.
Yeah.
We saw what happened in Stafford and Fredericksburg in terms of the way the precincts are drawn, but more importantly, the legislature will redraw not only state legislative districts but local ones as well as 4 congressional districts. Right. What's important in terms of having a bipartisan effort in that regard?
Woody, I concluded a long time ago, there's no way the legislature can objectively draw its own lines because we all have a self-interest. Our self-interest is our perpetuating our service in office. We're here because we want to be. And so when we get in office, sometimes we look at ways in which we can rig the system, and that's what it is, it's jury rigging the districts to make it easier for us to get elected. Now, I'm not necessarily the brightest guy in the world, but in 1982, recognizing what was happening, I put in a bill to create a nonpartisan redistricting commission.
1982.
1982. I pointed out because the bill didn't pass then. The Democrats who were in control then thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
I've introduced the bill many times since then. The Republicans in control, they think I'm crazy. I always bring that 1982 bill and hold it up and say, when Democrats were in control, I didn't think we could fairly draw the boundaries. And I was right. We drew them to our advantage. We thought it was to our advantage, but over time, Democrats lost because they did that. And I say to Republicans now, this is our opportunity. We haven't done it now, but I believe the courts are going to play a larger role.
Yes.
The courts may ultimately make us come to an honest assessment that whether you draw the lines this way or the lines this way determines who wins the election. And when you look at drawing the lines based on saving one legislator's position, you get all kinds of skewed results. And what happened up in that legislative area you're talking about around Fredericksburg was by cutting precincts to try to determine the outcome of the election, we got into a situation where we couldn't even figure out who was supposed to vote and who not vote in particular districts. So I've introduced my bill again. I need to count up. It's supposed to be 10 times I've introduced it. There are several other bills that have been introduced, some of which I actually like better than my own, candidly. But there's an organization called Virginia 2021 that is working on behalf of nonpartisan, fair representation in drawing district lines. They've been doing a heck of a job of educating the public. They've got a movie called Jury Rigged. Mm-hmm. I always want to promote that because I'm one of the stars in the movie, telling people about what this is all about. And so I'm hopeful that we now are around the corner of dealing with it differently, and the courts now seem to be willing to intervene to make sure it's done fairly.
Better chance this year of getting that bill out of privileges and elections?
I believe a bill, and again I say that to be totally honest with you, that I put my bill in again to make the point. Okay. I think there are better ways to do it than I envisioned in '82, but the point being is we need to recognize that we can't do it. We got to give it up to somebody impartially to look at. And the commission that gets that, their goal has to be the best interest of the Commonwealth. When the legislators do it, it's my best interest. It has to be the best interest of the state.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned the courts because I think there's a really interesting case pending before the U.S. Supreme Court dealing with the issue of to what extent politics should play a role in redistricting. Heretofore, the courts have stayed out of that issue totally, but now they may actually address it and hopefully in a positive way.
I think they have to. If you're trying to get around to equal protection of the law for people, I don't know how you can continue to pretend that partisan politics doesn't play a role in it. Will it always have a role? I tell you, we need a little role maybe, but we don't want it to have the dominant role that it has now. As a lot of people who are involved in this movement say, we want the people to pick the legislators, not the legislators picking the people.
Right.
Yeah.
Got about a minute left, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about the state of education in the Commonwealth and in your district, because you're a former educator, you've been interested and been a proponent of K through 12 and additional funding for education.
Well, my gosh, was I excited when our new governor, Northam, appointed a classroom teacher to be Secretary of Education. Now, there's a novel idea, to have a teacher making some of these decisions. Again, over the years, in our effort to try to improve education, sometimes we put ourselves too much in the classroom, and as a consequence, teachers have been burdened with testing and a whole bunch of stuff that took away from creating a creative learning environment where children can explore and so on. And as a result of that new Secretary of Education, I have high hopes.
Great. Thank you for being with us, Delegate Ken Plum.
My pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.